him. I thought what I'd do is talk for a few minutes, just give you kind of a picture of Pliny's letters as I see them, which might perhaps be itself a provocation to some questions, because it may be a little bit different from if you've done Pliny at school or something. I hope it might be a bit different from your kind of sense of what Pliny is all about. And then I've got 3 examples that I'll put up on screen and talk about the textuality and the intertextuality of Pliny's prose. And I'll say a bit more about that when we come to it. So I'm sure Pliny's a familiar name to most or all of you. But just to recap, Pliny the Younger, he's the nephew of Pliny the Elder, who wrote the Natural History. And Pliny the Younger is, well, both of them are examples of the new elite of the early Roman Empire. They are equestrian by birth, that is from the second rung down in the social hierarchy from what's by now northern Italy, the area around Como, Lake Como. But Pliny the Younger becomes a senator and rises pretty high. He becomes consul in the year 100 AD under the Emperor Trajan. And he subsequently becomes a governor of Bithynia and Pontus in modern Turkey. He's best known to us for his literary efforts, primarily his epistles, which when you pick up a book of the epistles appear to be in 10 books, but actually it's a 9-book collection that he wrote, like the 9 Muses, 247 letters, all by Pliny, addressed to friends and family, about 100 people, usually a few women, but nearly all men, a few family, but more likely friends and acquaintances. And they range from, I suppose, the least politically significant would be his own wife, who was a teenager when he was in his 40s. And the most politically influential, we'll come to in a little while, is Licinius Sura, who was basically Trajan's right-hand man. So this collection shows Pliny mixing in fairly high society, and it is a varied compendium of correspondence being a regular part of daily life, of course, but it is a highly artificial, literary-fied version of this. I think in the modern world, we're used to letters being potentially a literary form. Many people will buy a book of letters, the collected letters of a politician or a writer or something. And we also know of letters as a form of literary fiction. So, for instance, the French novel Dangerous Liaison and the Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. This was a genre that flourished in the late 18th and early 19th century. But I think we still have to think a bit harder when we approach ancient letter collections, which come in various shapes and sizes and often don't do what they claim to be doing on the tin. And that's one of the interesting things about them as literature. So Pliny wrote these 9 books of letters in roughly the years 96 to 109 AD. And in my belief, at least, although even if he published 1 book at a time, he then re-edited the whole collection. So it's effectively a single unified work, which presents itself as a miscellany. On the most superficial face of it, it looks a little bit like Cicero's letters. Now, from Pliny's point of view, Cicero was the great statesman, orator, politician of the mid-1st century BC, so 150 years back. And one of his great legacies, among a great deal of literary publication, was a huge body of correspondence, which was published after his death. And we have quite a lot of it still. We have about 900 of his letters. Pliny would have known at least twice that many, including letters to people like Octavian, Julius Caesar, and many others besides. Now, they present, those were not written for publication by Cicero. So when we read them, we really are looking over the shoulder of private correspondence. And it's through those that many people reconstruct the biography of Cicero and all sorts of elements of the history of the late Republic. There's a crucial difference, which is that Pliny does edit his own letters and publish them as a collection while he's still alive. So his letters, although they at some level are a new Ciceronian collection, and he indeed invites that comparison. He explicitly compares himself to Cicero and his letters to Cicero's. It's clearly a very different piece too. It's curated, it's self-published. There'd been another set of letters in the meantime of a very different sort. The philosopher Seneca the Younger, who's Nero's tutor, and amongst other things. One of his later works was a very large set of what he called epistolae morales, so ethical epistles or moral letters. And these are short, mostly very short, philosophical tracts, sort of like the ancestor of the modern sermon, presented as a series of letters to a friend, Lucilius. Now, in this case, the letter form is being harnessed for an explicitly non-epistolary work in origin. That is to say, no one really believes he ever wrote these letters to Lucilius, or this is a real set of correspondence, and they're very heavily focused on philosophy rather than everyday other facts of everyday life, for instance. So that gives us a second, very different model, which was also much, in my view, in Pliny's mind. This is the self-published and to some degree, perhaps a very high degree, artificial form of letter collection. And this is less obvious in Pliny's letters because he never actually mentions Seneca's letters, but that is clearly another text against which he is writing. So he often takes position against Seneca, incorporates elements of Seneca. And one of the ways you could look at his letters is as a blend of Cicero's real letters and Seneca's, as it were, artificial letters. A third element that's important to add in is that in Latin, well before Pliny's time, the letter had taken form as a form of poetry too. So some of Catullus's poems, a couple, are in the form of letters. Horace had written epistles, including the art of poetry. And then Ovid had written letters, first the mythical letters of heroines, the Heroides, and then letters in his own person from exile, the Tristia and the Epistolae ex Ponto. And all of those collections, especially Horace and Ovid, exemplify how the letter can be turned into a pretty rigid poetic form, carefully harnessed and marshaled into an artistic book, in which all those kind of high features of art that you know from things like the Eclogues or Horace's Odes are present in various ways. And I think that's an important third layer to Pliny's letters. So we have, on the one hand, the apparent collection of a statesman, on a second, a sort of a kind of ethical treatise in action, if you like. Pliny's letters, they tend to show, they portray the society he lives in various different ways. They'll tell you about events going on, about high politics, about deaths, character portraits of notable people. But above all, they depict Pliny himself at its center. As you'll know, if you've come across Pliny, he's often mocked for being a bit priggish, a bit self-satisfied. Certainly, it presents a kind of ideal Roman of action. And in that sense, there is an ethical side to it, which is not unlike Seneca, as well as very different in that Seneca urges spending time on contemplation, whereas Pliny shows us how you can make your part in society, as well as a man of literature. So there's Cicero, there's Seneca in that kind of ethical sense, and then there's the poetic influence. And the poetic influence shows itself in the highly mannered construction of Pliny's letters. I think anyone who reads them can see quite quickly they're very carefully written, but actually they are a real goldmine for thinking about the finer points of Latin style, which is something I'm interested in doing in life, and also for thinking about prose intertextuality. And that's the other thing that I get excited about, and it's going to be what I'm going to focus on in the rest of this little talk. As James mentioned, I got rather carried away with the question of how Pliny interacts with the work of Quintilian. Quintilian, his teacher, actually, who wrote a book called the Institutio Oratoria, the teaching of oratory, which we still have. It's a great treatise on how to become an orator, which is essentially education from a Roman point of view. And I got on to a sense, a belief that Pliny's letters are, they engage very regularly and minutely with Quintilian's Institutio. So they pick out little points of the text, and then they will take position on a topic and agree and or disagree with Quintilian. So this becomes a major intertextual encounter. So intertextuality being the ways in which you allude, echo, not directly cite other texts. Now, I think it's well known to anyone who's been exposed to, for instance, Virgil, that intertextuality is absolutely fundamental dimension of a great deal of Latin poetry. So I think it's axiomatic that you can only understand a certain amount of the Aeneid without thinking about the ways in which it is a rewriting of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and that is only the tip of the iceberg. Now, that is old hat, and there are people around indeed who think intertextuality has been going for too long and it's time we did something else, which is not necessarily all wrong. But in my view, there is still a serious underappreciation of the part that intertextuality plays in prose. And particularly in the Latin prose of the early empire. So this is up to and including people like Pliny, Quintilian, and Tacitus, who James mentioned I'm interested in at the moment and is going to feature again in a few minutes. So I'm on a bit of a mission, really, to try and prove to the world that I'm not just getting idiosyncratically excited in thinking that you miss a very large part of what's going on in works like Pliny's Letters and other prose works if you don't look at the intertextuality. And it's still something that's very under-researched. So it's not like you can just go to a commentary and see what the intertexts, as it were, of a given passage are. So that's something that's been sort of bugging me and interesting me about Pliny. And I've got a few examples to talk about. Let me just pull them up on screen, the first one. So this first one is from a letter, Epistles 4:3, to Arrius Antoninus. Arrius Antoninus was a consul like Pliny. He was actually pretty senior person, and one of these many curiously prophetic choices of Pliny. He would end up being the grandfather of the emperor Antoninus Pius. There are all sorts of people who come up with Pliny's letters who then have impressive connections in the years thereafter. So Pliny was clearly mixing interesting circles and or placing good bets. He writes to Arrius not to compliment him on his political success, although he mentions that, but to celebrate the Greek poetry that Antoninus has been writing. This is an example of how all Pliny's letters, although they apparently are personal letters, they're clearly written for consumption by a wider audience, because the whole letter takes some trouble to spell out quite how important Antoninus is and what he's been writing. And at the end of the letter, he comes to this. Often the letter ends with a kind of little climax of some sort. To think that someone Roman could speak so Greek. I do declare I wouldn't say Athens herself was so Attic. In a word, I envy the Greeks that you've chosen to write in their tongue. It takes no conjecture what you could express in our native language when you've produced such splendid works in this grafted and imported one. And that's the end of the letter. Typically, letters end with something of an epigram or something a bit memorable. Now, this letter, I think, ends with an engagement with a very famous passage of Lucretius. Late in Book 1 of the De Rerum Natura, his great work of atomic philosophy, Lucretius makes a remark about the challenge of writing in Latin on subjects which are much discussed in Greek. It's not the only time he does it, but this is one of those moments when he comes up with the theory of like parts of the philosopher Anaxagoras, homoia Maria, and it doesn't have a Latin name. So he says, now let us consider too that homoia Maria of Anaxagoras, which the Greeks speak of, and the destitution of our native language does not allow us to say in our own tongue, but it is easy nonetheless to set out the thing itself in works. And that includes it includes the phrase patriis sermonis egestas, the poverty of our native tongue. Now, if I just switch on some colors here, and one of the things I quite like about Zoom and being online and so on is you can now have colored handouts, which improve my life anyway, and they sort of suit this particular business, I think. If you compare the Lucretius and the Pliny, you can see there's a whole series of similarities, not just the phrase patrius sermo, which is actually quite a rare phrase. It comes up about 7 times in the extant Latin record from Lucretius, of which at least 4 or 5 are clearly echoing the same passage of Lucretius. Not just that, but you see we have the idea of Greeks and writing or speaking in a certain language that I put in green. And then Lucretius' final words, exponere verbis, to say, to lay out in words, come out in Pliny's exprimere possis, to express. And there you see is an echo of rhythm rather than of words. So that puts a bit more spice when Pliny uses the word conjectura, which can just mean it takes no conjecture, but that's a technical term of philosophy. So he puts that in. And also when he uses the word insiticio, an extremely unusual word, meaning grafted, as in grafting in the garden, in arboriculture. And he's used an almost unheard of Latin word, precisely when talking about the fact that Lucretius says it's very difficult to innovate when writing in Latin. All of which is a fairly small encounter, but it makes some important points, I think. For instance, if you're doing a reception history of Lucretius, if you want to know who was reading and talking about Lucretius in, let's say, the 1st century AD, you need to look beyond citation into intertextuality. This is an instance where, to my knowledge, Lucretius scholars haven't noticed that this is used here. And it's also an instance of why you're kind of missing quite a lot in Pliny's letter if you don't know this is going on. This is clearly part of the art, but there's kind of joke in here, I think. There's a certain play to this in having this kind of hidden allusion. And just to confirm that, Pliny writes a second letter to Antoninus later in book 14, in which he says, well, I've been so admiring your Greek poetry that I've decided to try translating it into Latin. And Pliny likes writing verses on the side. But he compliments Antoninus by saying, well, this is impossible because I can't get Latin to match the quality of your Greek. And he says, how can I better prove to you how much I admired your Greek epigrams than by the fact that I've tried to emulate and express some of them in Latin, but for the worse. This happens first through the weakness of my talent, then through the poverty, or rather, as Lucretius says, the destitution of our native language. So here in his second letter to Antoninus, he reveals what was disguised in the first letter by actually citing Lucretius. This is a common technique that you get in all sorts of Latin literature of belated revelation, where you underline what you did the first time, but now you make it clear to people. And that, amongst other things, absolutely confirms that what I suggested about the first letter is a deliberate bit of intertextual play, and also suggests, well, partly that we need to read these letters not just one by one, but it's one hint of many at how this collection adds up to a more complicated whole. And partly, again, it confirms that, as it were, the intertextual play, there's a reason that people talk about allusion quite a lot, ad ludere, to play towards, is a very important part of what's going on here. I've got a second example, which involves another philosopher, actually. Epistles 7:1 writes to a young senator this time, Roscianus Geminus, who will become consul quite a lot later. He's perhaps in his 20s, Pliny's in about his 40s. And it's advising him not to give in. He's feeling ill. Roscianus has a long-term illness, or at least it's going on for a while. And Pliny says, tough it out. And then, as often, he flavors his advice. He gives it substance by describing how he himself coped when he was very ill. And here's a little bit of what he says. Once, in fact, I was racked with a fiercely burning fever. When at last it had abated and I'd had a rub down, the doctor was giving me a drink. I held out my hand and told him to touch it, that is, take my pulse, and I gave back the cup that had already been lifted to my lips. So this is an impressive act. He was about to have a drink, and then when he realized there might be a problem, he forsook the drink. Later, on the 20th day of my illness, when I was being prepared for the baths, I suddenly saw the doctors muttering and asked the reason. They replied I could bathe safely, but not altogether without some concerns. What, I said, is it essential? That is the bath essential? And so I calmly and mildly abandoned hope of the bath that I thought I was already being carried into. And I fixed my mind and countenance, as I had a moment before on baths, back on abstinence. And so Pliny shows, once again, potentially, slightly amusingly, an ideal moment of everyday life, the ethics of turning down a trip to the steam room. Now, what's very interesting about this, amongst other things, seems to me the underlay of Valerius Maximus. Now, Valerius Maximus is not a hugely well-known author outside classical circles, but he was a very well-known author in Pliny's day. In the reign of Tiberius, so early 1st century AD, he wrote a collection called Facta et Dicta Memorabilia, memorable sayings and doings. And it's a collection of improving anecdotes, and they're often culled from Livy or from Cicero's philosophical works. And he goes through by theme. And in book 7, he's on, he's on good fortune, but chapter 2 is on wise words and sayings. And this is an example of people who have the good fortune to be able to say or do smart things. And the first of his foreign examples, that's what the X stands for in the citation, is not entirely surprisingly Socrates. He comes up with a few examples of how Socrates was exemplary. And the last of them is this. When the wicked madness of the Athenians had passed grim sentence on his life, so this is about his coming death, and he had taken with bold heart and resolved countenance the poisoned drink from the executioner's hand, he had already lifted the cup to his lips when his wife Xanthippe, weeping and wailing, cried out that he was going to die an innocent man. What then, he said, did you think it would be better for me to die guilty? What boundless wisdom, says Valerius, which even at the very moment of leaving life could not forget itself. Now, it's a rather unlikely combination, but when you look at Pliny's letter and Valerius's little thing on Socrates, and you play my color game, what you see is that Pliny has re-inscribed this tale of Socrates drinking hemlock into his own tale of first refusing a drink of water or wine or whatever, and then turning down a trip to the baths, which is frankly quite amazing at first sight. It almost beggars belief that Pliny would compare himself to Socrates, but it seems to me beyond question. I should say there are kind of footnotes I could supply to all this where I sort of say this particular phrase only comes up here in excellent Latin, or this is a particularly unusual use of whatever. And I should say that's one of the things I find quite interesting about doing this work. It makes you think very hard about usage, about choices of cases, the kinds of things that actually Romans did get excited about in their recitations of literature and comments on each other's literature. So it seems there's a fairly clear case that this is indeed, I'm not just imagining this. So what do you see from that? Well, first of all, you see another example of Pliny bringing in, and I say these are just small examples of how Pliny's letters actually kind of draw on a huge range of Latin literature and indeed Greek literature. There's Homer and Callimachus, amongst other things, in these letters. It also shows that Valerius Maximus, about whom many people are quite snobbish, was actually quite highly regarded in antiquity, and Tacitus, for instance, it also clearly shows his reading and good memory of him. But it also, it's worth trying to think a little bit about why Pliny might be doing this. And there is, I think it points us back towards the sort of ethical side of these letters. Valerius Maximus is telling a tale of superb stoic resolution shown in a moment of pretty high drama. Now, Pliny, as I said, it's almost laughable when Pliny brings that into something so trivial as a slightly ill man taking a bath. But I actually think this tells us something about what the epistles is trying to do, which is to show you in the kind of everyday humdrum life of an ordinary person, how you can try to be, how you can try to live a good life, in this case, to show self-control. So there's a sort of element of kind of the opposite of what epic does, which is to take the ordinary and make it super ordinary. It kind of brings the super ordinary back down to the ordinary, and that goes hand in hand with the genre of letters, which is a professedly simple and humble genre. My third example is a little sort of snippet from the work I'm kind of up to at the moment, which is a book about Pliny and Tacitus. I said I wrote a book in which I claimed that Pliny's letters is a wholesale rewrite of Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, and I sort of stand by that claim. But what I sort of worked out since, or in my view worked out, I've certainly come to the view that Pliny's also, at the same time, perhaps even more so, engaged in a wholesale rewriting of Tacitus's histories. Now, Tacitus is a well-known name. The historian, he was like Pliny, an equestrian. He became a senator. He was about just 3 or 4 years older than Pliny and personally acquainted with him. Pliny writes 11 letters to him in this collection, starting with a letter about laughter, in which Pliny talks about how he spends his time hunting, actually writing. I've just put some snippets here on the screen. He's one of the most famous letters, which is pretty much the only letter most people have read of Pliny, who've read a letter of Pliny, is letter 616, where he describes the death of his uncle Pliny the Younger at the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, purportedly because Tacitus is writing his account of 79 AD and has asked Pliny for source material. And there's a follow-up, 620, where he writes about his own experience of it. There are other letters. Epistle 733, Pliny supplies some more information now about events from the early 90s AD, and he starts it with a joke about augury, because Pliny was an augur, he was a priest called an augur, that he augurs that Tacitus's histories will be immortal. All this by way of just showing that Tacitus's histories are heavily thematized in Pliny's letters. And he ends his correspondence with Tacitus, Epistles 9:14, with a rather mystical letter about how they are engaged in some kind of common project. As often, it poses as a reply to a letter that we've lost, and therefore you have to kind of guess what Tacitus might have written to him. But it ends with this rather pregnant idea about letters continuing along the path we've begun. It's carried few out into the light of fame, but it has brought many out of the darkness of silence. And incidentally, there is one of Pliny's many jokes, because Tacitus is Latin for quiet, and it's no accident that the word for silence crops up there at the end of his last letter. Now, Tacitus's histories, just to fill in, are not quite so well known as his annals. The annals are his great late work of history that includes the surviving parts are on the emperors Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. The histories he wrote a little bit earlier, but they cover a later period. They cover the year of the four emperors, AD 69, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. And they did cover the Flavian emperors, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, but most of the histories is lost. We only have 4 and a bit books. Now, my thesis in the book I'm talking about that I'm trying to write, it's kind of half written and just I need to get on and finish it, is that in the epistles, Pliny does a wholesale rewriting of the histories. And this is clearly that there's a big space for speculation about what happens to the books of histories we don't have, because obviously we just don't know. But there is a huge amount of evidence that the bit of the histories we do have is very much in Pliny's mind, and that overturns, for what it's worth, a chronological assumption that most people have, that the epistles predates the history and histories. It also would show a very significant early piece of reception of the histories. That is the first evidence we would have of someone reading Tacitus's histories and what they think of it, because although Tacitus is a very great historian, for us, he's surprisingly little talked about, or there are surprisingly few reflexes of him in the 100 or 200 years after he wrote. And it would also, again, tell us something fundamental, I think, about Pliny's epistles. So just for the purposes of this chat, I just want to give you one little example. It's from a fun letter in the epistles, Epistle 727, which is about ghost stories. He writes to Licinius Sura, I mentioned him earlier as Trajan's right-hand man. And he tells he says, do you think ghosts exist? Phantasmata, he calls them. And then he writes a letter which basically is pushing him to his correspondent to say yes. The second story involves a philosopher, Athenodorus, who rents a haunted house in Athens. And here it's a story not specific to Pliny. It appears elsewhere in literature, but here is part of his narrative of it. Athenodorus rents this house in the knowledge that it allegedly has a ghost, because he's actually interested to see what's going on. Everyone else is scared off. When dusk set in, he ordered his bed to be laid in the front part of the house, called for notebooks, a pen, and a light, and sent all his staff to the inner rooms. He himself focused mind, eyes, and hand on writing, so that his mind would not be free to imagine phantom sounds and empty fears. At first, there was the usual silence of night. Then iron was shaken, chains moved. He did not raise his eyes or drop his pen, but shut off his mind and put that ahead of his ears. Then the noise grew louder and closer. Now it seemed to come from the door. Now from inside the door. He looked around. He saw and recognized the ghost as he had been told about. It was standing and bending its finger, as if summoning him. Athenodorus, in reply, indicated with his hand that it should wait, and applied himself to his wax and pen once more. It rattled its chains over his head as he wrote. And eventually Athenodorus agrees to follow the ghost, who shows him a spot in the house, which the next day is dug up, and they find a skeleton with chains, so they're able to exorcise this man. Now, this is a good example of Pliny's narrative skill. You can see why a text like this gets set for school study. It's also quite another of these moments that does lend itself to a bit of a laugh at the image of this philosopher who simply beckons the ghost and says, hang on, I'm busy writing something, you'll have to wait a minute. But you can take that more seriously as a kind of a display of the all-importance of literary work, such as done by Pliny. But the side of this I want to pick up on is a strange Tacitian subtext. In Book 2 of the Histories, Tacitus narrates the first battle of Cremona in April 69 AD, at which Otho, the second emperor of the year of 4 emperors, his army loses to Vitellius, who was going to become the third. And Otho is basically a pretty bad emperor. He's a young, lascivious, and not very desirable creature, according to Tacitus. But at this moment, he suddenly shows a good side because he commits suicide rather than prolong the fighting. And at this moment, Tacitus rises up and gives him a fantastic Stoic death scene, from which I just pick out a little selection here. After this, namely after having given a pep talk to his nephew, he dismissed everyone and rested a little. And then I miss a bit out. As day turned to dusk, he calmed his thirst with a draught of cool water. Then he had 2 daggers brought, tried them both, and put one under his head. Having ascertained that his friends had now left, he passed a quiet, and so it is said, not sleepless night. At first light, he fell on the steel with his breast. That's classic with the Tacitus narrative. It's brief, it's pregnant, it's rather grandiose, and you see just through simplicity, he captures the splendor of this bold death. And then I just, for a reason you'll see in a second, I put a sentence from about a page later about the aftermath of his death, and it's about Virginius Rufus, who the soldiers clamor around trying to get him to agree to be emperor, but he sneaks out of the back door. He left secretly through the rear part of the house, so evading them as they burst in. So there's a little selection from Otho's suicide. Now you can guess what I'm going to do next, which is to put them on the screen at the same time. And what you see is, strange to tell, mirabile dictu, Pliny's tale of Athenodorus and a ghost is a rewrite of Otho's suicide. Now, this is a really extraordinary thing, it seems to me. It pursues a whole series of little details. You see they're particularly cluster at the start of Pliny, and it involves some radical transformations. So when Otho requests 2 daggers to be brought, Athenodorus requests that notebooks be brought. And the biggest of all, the other red bit, Otho falls, literally he leans over the steel with his chest, ferrum pectora incubuit. Well, steel or iron comes up in the chains, in the middle of Pliny's bit, and then Athenodorus, he literally leans over the wax and his pen. Incumbo, in both cases being used quite unusually. Tacitus has a novel construction for that as a way of saying you fall on your sword, but it's a very arcane way of saying it. And Pliny uses it differently. He means applied himself to, metaphorically, but it's the same word, and it's that usage is unique in both of those authors. And you can, I should say, I've just picked out, for the sake of getting this on a single page, the tip of the iceberg. But the bottom line is that this letter is, and all 3 sections of the Ghost letter actually, are all very closely rewriting the death of Otho, which is, as I say, a pretty astounding thing. I think it's not impossible to see why. There are kind of chains of connection. One of them is about death and burial, and there is a slightly deeper one which actually relates to the Socrates, which is, these are 2 stories of Stoic resolve. Otho kills himself rather than showing fear of death. Athenodorus, in a very different way, shows fearlessness in the face of a ghost. But I picked them out just as one example among very, very many of how Pliny rewrites Tacitus, and it's an interesting business. I'm still kind of deciding exactly what I think he's up to, but I think part of the story is that from Tacitus's very grand, high, serious, weighty history of the past, Pliny produces a humble, apparently simple, ephemeral set of writings about the present. So there's a kind of opposition in the repetition, if you see what I mean. And part of it is presumably about a kind of literary game for people who are into finding this kind of stuff. I hope I'm not the only person who's ever thought this is interesting. But above all, I think it exemplifies how far, to repeat myself a little bit, how far you miss out on so much Latin literature if you don't attend to these intertextual depths. I think the interpretation of this letter only gets a very small part of the way if you're not aware of the Tacitus in the mix. And that is a point, I think, with broader ramifications for how we read Latin literature more generally. So in that sense, I hope I have not just bored you about Pliny this evening, but I think it's time I stop talking and let you, James, pose any questions that you may have. Thanks for listening so far.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yes, so people have been writing in the chat. I mean, so let's take them in. Well, it doesn't matter what order. I mean, so one question was, I think, related to some of the things you were saying earlier on about the kind of models that Pliny had available to him, and you were talking about particularly Cicero on the one hand and Seneca on the other, and Pliny somehow sort of sitting between these two. But people are interested in whether Pliny also had Greek models in mind for this kind of epistolary project, the self-presentation through a kind of epistolary connection. And I wonder whether you would just have something to say about, he's clearly reading Greek, so is this a very Roman thing that Pliny is doing, exclusively Roman, maybe?
It's a really good question, and to be honest, I wish I knew a better answer than I have. Yes, there are letters in Greek, and for instance, the letters attributed to Plato were famous already in Cicero's days and would have been known to Pliny. And then later we get letters as a form of fiction. So Alciphron, for instance, the letters of courtesan, that's more, that's pushing almost more in the direction of sort of dangerous liaisons and that sort of thing. But that's a little bit later. I'm not aware of a Greek collection that's at all comparable to Pliny's. I suppose it is peculiarly Roman in any case, in that it is the sort of the self-presentation of the public life of a senator. It is very specifically Roman in that sense. I mean, you can imagine how that actually by Pliny's day, such a thing is not inconceivable in Greek. You have this is the time at which a serious influx of senators from the east is beginning, and it's not much later that we have quite a lot of senatorial literature in Greek, like a little bit later, the historian Cassius, for instance. But no, I'm afraid I don't know of significant Greek models, which is quite interesting in itself. I guess if you trace it poetically, through, I mentioned Catullus's poetic, letter poems with poetic letters, that might take you back to the way that Hellenistic epigram can often have a certain addressee, but I don't think it's regularly formed as a letter itself. So in that measure, to my knowledge, here too, Pliny it is a new departure, but I'd be pleased to be corrected if people know of anything else.
No, that sounds right. I mean, with Cicero, people are often keen to invoke the notion of Roman amicitia as something that these kinds of letter collections are very much emphasizing, displaying, and so on. Is that a thing for Pliny as well? Is he keen to show his amici and how connected he is?
Yeah, that's interesting. So yes, amicitia is such a major currency for Cicero. It's kind of how you do business, and that obviously covers a very wide range of sins, between literally being a friend, and then that covers basically patronage. Amicus is the courteous word for cliens, for your client. Yes, in a different way, because Pliny is staging all this. It is less the case, I think, that we're actually seeing him deploying amicitia for personal gain or for political gain, which is what we see in Cicero's letters. Rather, it shows him staging how it works. One way of reading Pliny's letters is as a kind of a DIY guide to how you write letters and how you go about being an elite Roman. And incidentally, it's one reason I don't believe, as many do, that Pliny was writing only for his senatorial peers. I think that misses the point, because what Pliny's letters doing is putting on a pedestal a kind of VIP life that I think is presumed to be interesting to people who are not VIPs. And this is a period when we have quite a wide provincial readership. Pliny himself says that copies of his books are for sale in Lyon. Marshall, writing about the same time, talks about people, centurions in northern Britain thumbing his pages. So I think actually he's writing for quite a wide public, and so he's displaying elite amicitia, and perhaps also then presenting a model for how they might do amicitia in their humble little places.
Good. So people have obviously got interested with your theme of intertextuality in these works. So someone asks, well, is this a kind of flattering plagiarism? And I suppose that what that leads me to ask is there a difference between some of the examples that you used? So, for example, invoking Lucretius in a letter to a friend might be rather different from invoking Tacitus in a letter to a friend. Tacitus might well be expected to read and appreciate this in a way that Lucretius didn't. So in what ways does as it were, the target of the intertextuality respond? Are there ways in which these people are kind of expected to notice?
Yeah, thank you. There's a couple of interesting things there. The bit about, is it what was it, flattering
plagiarism?
Yeah, I mean, so just before I come to the second part, James, there's every act of intertextuality, and if we go back to say Virgil and Homer, you can kind of spin it two opposite ways. One is the sort of piety model, that you're showing piety, admiration to your model. The other is the parricidal model in Bloomian terms, which is you are, killing your father in rewriting it. So you're not just adding, but you're kind of replacing in your supplement. So there is a degree to which, I mean, one of the Roman terms for this is immollatio, right? It's competition when you engage with another author. So there's kind of an expectation that it is flattering to compete with someone, of course, to see them as worthy of competition. But it would be, I mean, when ancient authors write about imitatio, they say it's pretty poor show if you're not also competing. Otherwise, you're just being feeble. So I think both elements are there in that sense. But you also raise a very interesting question about contemporaneity. I think most people are familiar with the idea that intertextuality involves invoking, say, the classics. So to go back to the Aeneid again, Homer, Apollonius. But it is different when you engage with a contemporary author. And one of the striking things that I think I've learned about Pliny is that actually it's the contemporary authors, Quintilian and Tacitus. So Quintilian is dead by the time he's writing, but was a near contemporary. Tacitus is very much alive, as you say, that they are actually the ones who are most present. And you're right, there's a whole sociological element to this. Who was exactly reading these works when? Pliny very explicitly spells out, he paints a world where literary recitation is a standard form of elite entertainment and socializing. So it is perfectly, it's probably simply factual to say that Pliny would have probably first performed these letters in reading circles, which might have been attended exactly by someone like Tacitus. So yes, there's got to be quite a lot of kind of in-crowd stuff going on. And presumably, yeah, it's got to be flattery at quite a significant level, particularly in Tacitus's case. But again, I guess you would hope that that Pliny would not want to be so spineless as merely to be echoing him and showing his reverence for him. Incidentally, there's another whole kind of postscript to this, which is something for another day, which is how Tacitus in the Annals, which is a later work, how he then echoes Pliny. Both the epistles and the panegyricus in turn. So we do actually see it's kind of game of give and take going here.
Good. I will come back to that almost immediately. So one of our audience would like you to say a bit more about this idea of the humility of the letters that you raised, or the kind of the notion that they're invoking a kind of a theatre of humility in comparison with some of the things they're deliberately alluding to. And I suppose it also comes with a bit of a kind of a question mark about, are we really to buy this idea of this comparison, or the invited comparison between Pliny and the bath and Socrates and his death? I mean, I wonder whether people are kind of quite sold on that, despite all the underlining. I mean, what it made me think of is the scene of Seneca's death in the Annals, which looks a kind of like a sort of botched version of a Socratic picture too. And I wonder whether there's a complicated story that reaches through Valerius to Cato and other kinds of Roman examples. But you might ignore that for now, and you and I can talk about that some other time. But two things. Have you got more in store if people don't quite buy the cover? And second, could you say a bit more about this idea of the letters as a kind of a world of the kind of humdrum or the everyday?
Yeah, the more in store question is one I'm quite used to. So when I put the Quintilian brief thing, when I was kind of writing that, I gave various seminars on it, papers, and without fail, about half the questions were, really, you're just exaggerating this. And one consequence is I rather overbaked it in the book, and I was criticized by one reviewer for, why do you feel so hard that you had to prove this? It's perfectly obvious. And to be honest, the argument comes mainly from, it's kind of safety in numbers in a nutshell. If I won't right now, but I could throw you quite a lot more instances of how Pliny is reworking Valerius Maximus. I could throw you, I said there are kind of footnotes about, how the particular language it goes beyond the fact of whatever words I put in bold. It goes to details of exactly how they're used. And then I could give you, well, actually, the Athenodorus story is something of a parallel for how a very grand event can be refashioned as what you might say a very mundane event. And that is, again, that's a type of event that you see quite happening quite often. So that's why I've moved beyond paranoia to the danger of being overconfident, I guess. I should say, I mean, I will confess that Quintilian book was held up for a long time, because when I first came across the material, I simply couldn't believe it, and I thought I got this wrong, and it was a long time before I kind of had the confidence to run with it. I had something similar with the Tacitus, actually. I spent a long time wondering if some of this is Tacitus echoing Pliny, and again, I'm an indecisive kind of creature when it comes to these sorts of things, but I've finally come down off the fence, and I'm probably going to stay on the side I'm on. So as for the humility, I have to say I never quite felt I've got exactly on top of this, because it does take you back to something quite difficult about the epistles. One of the reasons people don't always take it terribly seriously, which is that it does seem to be showing a sort of slightly mediocre person in some ways, presenting himself as a starry beacon. And I mean, one answer is, okay, Pliny is actually, he's misjudged this, and he's got it wrong, and he's not got the depth and the brains of some other authors, and that's the answer many people are satisfied with. And it's not actually, that's not exclusive. That's not ruled out by showing that he's extremely refined in his artistic procedures. But I do wonder if there's some other version that we should be reaching for, which kind of, I tried to gesture a little bit towards it, which is he's trying to sort of present an everyman with a capital E. So this is an imperfect self-portrait. And so that's one reason that he shows imperfections. I mean, that he's a bit like Horace, for instance, who, it's a good teaching technique to show yourself imperfect. So there's that. And then another side of it is the cultural anchoredness of self-display. So, if you think even today, the difference in what's acceptable and desirable in self-display between certain Asian cultures and say the UK and say the US, there are slightly different norms or bandwidths across those. And it's certainly, from what we can tell, basically what we consider egotistic arrogance was pretty accepted or standard in Roman elite discourse. So there's another side to it there about a degree of cultural situatedness. And then thirdly, to come back to the word James used, humility, I do think there's something very important generically going on. One reason Tacitus is thought of as a very grand figure is because he writes in the grand style of history, which is a grand genre. Now Pliny writes in a professedly humble style, and that is part of his his shtick, basically, in terms of how he's actually creating a new genre in the epistles, and along with that is creating the persona, the hero, if you like, of it. So I'm sorry, those thoughts are a little bit muddy, but those are the kinds of the sorts of things I think in response to that question.
No, that's really great. Thank you. I mean, a really interesting question, I think, is provoked by this. So, you mentioned, and it certainly was the case with me, that the first time I encountered Pliny was as a GCSE author. And so the question is, do you think that that has done Pliny a disservice? And if you were kind of introducing Pliny without those kind of prejudices, do you think the choice of letters that we read, or we serve up as an initial encounter with Pliny, could be better? I mean, I imagine most people read, as you said, the Vesuvius letters, or I think the other ones people read are the ones, what do I do with these Christians, in book 10. So those tend to be the bits people dig into. Mm-hmm. So do you think we could do better with our choice of letters to show, or are there just better ways of encouraging people to read the letters that we already and regularly read?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Christians letters, because I bracketed out book 10 altogether today, but it is worth saying that over the last 2,000 years, they're probably the lines of Pliny that have been most pored over for obvious reasons. That's pretty much the first pagan text to describe Christianity. This is letters 96 and 97 in book 10. It's an interesting and difficult question, that. I'm pondering it slightly because I've been asked to write one of those new surveys in the classics on Pliny, and I have to say, because quite a lot of what I do is quite it's not terribly open to the uninitiated. I mean, this kind of, putting individual words in red and stuff is not a great way to introduce GCSE students to Latin. So I do find that a little bit tricky. I think, well, one answer is there is a very different way to approach Pliny's letters. It's not quite for GCSE, but for perhaps a little bit further up, which is, and this is something I try to argue for in that commentary you mentioned, which is, he writes them as books. There are 9 books, and each book is a crafted artistic unity. And I think that's one thing that has gone seriously by the wayside in the last 500 years, because anthologies have been made of Pliny for as long as Pliny's been in print, and indeed longer. And nowadays, nearly everyone accesses it through an anthology. So just reading selections, yes, you're getting a very filtered view, aren't you? And I have to say that the Vesuvius letter is a pretty good place to start. But people tend to, the school selections tend to privilege kind of nice glimpses into everyday life. They're picked out for their social historical import or interest rather than anything else. So there is that, that trying to read them by the book is a rather different exercise, and has got some, you see different things, and indeed trying to read it as a collection. Well, I was going to say something else, and it's just slipped my mind.
That's all right. We don't have a lot of time left. So one question is, you kind of pointed us to the late 18th, early 19th century epistolary novel, and there's also obviously kind of the collections of letters that are often edited and produced posthumously, the letters of T.S. Eliot, or the letters of Churchill, or whatever it is. Do you think there's anything that really does approach what Pliny's letters are in the last 200 years?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. I should have an answer ready for that question, but I haven't come across any. I'd be pleased if anyone's got any suggestions to put in the chat. But so a kind of a curated set of letters by someone, which, and I should say, in my more radical moments, I don't actually believe that Pliny ever sent any of these as letters. So it's not even a collection of letters that he's tarted up. It's as it were a work of fiction presented as letters. there's complications, of course, because it's a historical fiction and that it describes all sorts of actual historical events. But I mean, it's almost more like someone's first novel, in a kind of repackaging your experiences of life in a partly fictionalized way. So no, it is quite a unique thing, actually, it seems to me. So later antiquity, obviously, you have tons and tons of people publishing their own letters, although not many in the kind of stylized way that Pliny does. There's Sidonius Apollinaris is the guy. So in the 5th century in Bordeaux, and he explicitly presents himself as a latter-day Pliny. So, but that's about 1,500 years out of date. So I'll have to work on a more modern.
And am I right that books 1 to 9, it's a one-sided correspondence? So there are no replies included there.
No, it's completely one-sided. So he will often imply receipt of a letter to which he's replying, but that, I mean, depending on your point of view, that it's either lost or that's a literary conceit.
Yeah. So that does mark him out as different from Cicero, certainly, where you often get included. Although it seems to me that there's been an attempt to read Cicero's letters as books as well. I mean, those are curated, probably not by Cicero, but at least by somebody.
Exactly. So they're also edited, and they do also. There's been a lot of reading Cicero by the book going on the last 10 years, and so that the point is they are edited by someone else. So, but that someone else also is an artist who is creating an interesting construct out of pre-existing material. So yeah, that is a related but slightly different.
The only thing I can think of are, you know, these politicians' diaries, where I'm never entirely convinced they haven't been carefully edited. But,
yeah, no, definitely, where they have surprisingly anticipated some major world event. Yeah,
and I was proved right, you know, that kind of thing. Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for those who offered our questions. Thank you especially to Chris. Thank you for joining us. Obviously, it's really important for us to keep in touch with our alumni, and we do think this is a really helpful way of showing you the variety of work going on in the faculty, and you can find out ways of supporting us in what we do if you just follow the link that's on the screen. Just to let you know, if you haven't signed up already, our next session is on Wednesday, the 22nd of February. That's really interesting. So 3 new colleagues, actually, Leah Nicolai, Ben Colbeck and Laura Castelli are going to be joining us to talk about their work and the work that's going on generally on late antiquity, historically, philosophically, and so on. That's very much a growth area, and we think that's probably something where we'll all learn something very important. But for me, that's it. So thank you, and I hope to see you then.